Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for taking some time out of your day to listen to me talk about extended producer responsibility for textiles. The participant numbers are still climbing a little bit, but we're at the top of the hour, so I will be prompt and make a start. Just before we dive into the session, I will quickly introduce myself so you all know who's speaking to you today. My name is Jordan Girling, as you can see, and I'm currently serving as Head of Extended Producer Responsibility at WRAP. WRAP are a climate action charity that work around the globe to tackle the causes of the climate crisis and give the planet a more sustainable future. Our corporate vision is a thriving world in which climate change is no longer a problem. Myself personally, I've spent the last 10 plus years working with national and international stakeholders across the EPR value chain on extended producer responsibility systems for various problematic waste streams, including electronics, batteries, product packaging, and textiles, as you can guess by the topic of this webinar. Just before we start, I saw there's a question in the Q&A function already. Yes, we are recording the webinar. We'll circulate the recording of the webinar as well as a PDF copy of the slides to everybody attending and probably everybody who registered in the first instance in case they weren't able to attend the actual live session. So don't worry, we'll share it with you afterwards. So regarding the content of today's webinar, firstly, whilst I'm sure that everybody attending the webinar is probably aware of what the extended producer responsibility concept is, just to ensure we're all on the same page, we will clarify that. We'll then move on to extended producer responsibility systems for textiles and why we should care about textile waste. We will touch on the EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles, what that is and why it's important, followed by an overview of textiles EPR systems worldwide with some slightly more detailed sections for France, Norway, and California. And lastly, we will conclude the webinar by briefly discussing how WRAP can support companies with the explosion of textiles EPR systems across the world. Okay, like I said, I'm sure that many of the attendees know what extended producer responsibility is, just to ensure we're all on the same page. Extended producer responsibility is sometimes referred to under the polluter pays principle. It's a regulatory mechanism that's used to finance the costs associated to the environmentally friendly management of a product or its packaging once it reaches its end of life. And obligations to finance such operations are placed on manufacturers or sellers, and they're typically referred to as producers under the legislation, hence the phrase extended producer responsibility. Traditionally, the concept of EPR has been applied to three main waste streams, which correspond with EU directives. We have WEEE, which is acronym for Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment. We have batteries and we have product packaging. There are some pioneering countries like France and the Netherlands, for example, to name a couple, that have started to introduce the concept of EPR for other waste streams, such as clothing and other textiles, although EPR systems for textiles are not yet widespread. So if a manufacturer or seller has EPR obligations, what do they actually need to do? Well, they have a number of obligations to comply with. In summary, generally, an obligated company needs to register as a producer with the national regulator. And sometimes that registration needs to be completed via a national authorized representative. And that depends on how the products are being sold and the national legislation. It's also quite important to note that it's not just local companies that can be classed as a producer. There's many of the textile EPR systems around Europe, particularly, place obligations on foreign companies that distance sell directly to end users. And that's the case even if the distant seller doesn't have a physical presence in the country of sale. The company also needs to implement appropriate collection and recycling compliance arrangements. And what is deemed as appropriate compliance arrangements is dependent on the types of products that are being sold and the national system. Once the company is registered, they have the obligation to submit systematic sales declarations to regulators. And as well as all of that, companies need to comply with some provisions such as product marking requirements and to provide information to consumers on the recyclability and collection networks. And sometimes they have things like durability and recyclability targets too. So we know that textiles have quite a significant environmental impact, and between 8 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from clothing and footwear. The EU generates 12.6 million tons of textile waste per year, and in the UK alone, 23 million garments are sent to landfill or incinerated each year, which generates 750,000 tons of CO2 emissions. Given all of this, whilst textiles have such a significant environmental impact, EPR systems have been relatively uncommon for this waste stream, with the majority of these EPR systems worldwide being for the electronics waste stream, which make up about 35% of all EPR systems worldwide. So why should we care about textile waste? Well, there's quite a lot of reasons why we should care about textile waste. Like we noticed, textiles have a huge impact on the climate and have the fourth highest impact on the environment and climate in Europe. In the EU and the USA combined, 29 million tons of textile waste is generated each year, and the value lost every year from clothing underutilization and lack of recycling is $460 billion. The total volume of greenhouse gases emitted from textile production annually is 1.2 billion tons. And that's more than the emissions from all international flights and maritime shipping combined. The planning of national EPR systems for textiles has increased quite dramatically across the European Union recently and will continue to do so. And this is primarily due to the EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles and a proposal or suggested amendments to the Waste Framework Directive. So the EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles, that was published in March 2022. And in line with the strategy, a proposal that would require the mandatory adoption of textiles EPR systems, that was published in July 2023. And in parallel, there's many other countries around the world that are planning similar EPR systems for the textile waste stream. EPR systems for textiles, they don't necessarily only apply to clothing. The scope can be quite extensive. So the scope of textiles EPR set by the European Commission is clothing, apparel, footwear, blankets, rugs, bed linen, and curtains. And the estimated EPR fee from the European Commission is around 12 euro cents per garment. Following the EPR proposal and the EU strategy, we know that producers will be required to cover the costs of managing textile waste, and producers will be given incentives to reduce waste and increase the textile products. Now, the way that that's done in practice is likely to vary somewhat from country to country. The European Union the vision for textiles is that all textile products placed on the EU market are durable, repairable, and recyclable. and they plan to set design requirements for textiles to make them last longer, make them easier to repair and recycle, and potentially set minimum levels of recycled content. And some other key focus areas are the desire to reverse overproduction and overconsumption, discouraging the destruction of unsold or returned textiles, and also tackling greenwashing. And also, in an attempt to tackle illegal exports to developing countries, there will be a new definition of what constitutes as textile waste and what is considered as reusable textiles. Online marketplaces, they will be obligated to register under textiles EPR systems and obtain self-certification from producers that their products meet EPR requirements in the consumer's place of residence. Now, it has been proposed that micro enterprises would be exempt from EPR obligations. It's quite noteworthy that that has received quite a lot of pushback from industry stakeholders because micro enterprises actually represent 88% of the market. And as you can imagine, if you exclude 88% of the market from an EPR system, the EPR system is probably not going to be very successful. And last but not least, another noteworthy point, eco-modulation of EPR fees will be applied, where producers of harder to recycle products are charged higher EPR fees and producers of easier to recycle products are charged lower EPR fees. In December 2023, the European Parliament published a briefing that included an image depicting the progress of proposal adoption. As you can see, good progress has been made, but there's still a few administrative steps to go. This graphic, it was published by the European Commission in December 23. It is slightly outdated. On 14th of February, I think, Valentine's Day, the Environment Committee of the European Parliament, they voted to adopt. So we are one step further along. This graphic is quite a good visual representation of textiles EPR systems worldwide, with the dark blue showing active textiles EPR systems, the green showing textiles EPR systems that are upcoming or pending implementation, the orange showing textiles EPR systems that have been drafted or are being planned, and the light blue illustrates Australia's voluntary system. This slide gives a bit more granular detail on some national textiles EPR systems that were highlighted on the previous slide. The table shows the status of the EPR systems in particular countries, how the scope of the EPR systems vary slightly between countries, and the approximate producer payable fee associated to the national system. So to take an example, the textiles EPR system in the Netherlands typically applies to consumer clothing, workwear, and household textiles, but it does not apply to shoes, blankets, or curtains. And it has a 10 euro cent per kilogram fee associated to the system for 2024. Whereas the textiles EPR system in Sweden will charge EPR fees slightly differently per unit, probably, rather than per kilogram, with the EPR fee for a single t-shirt expected to be around 2 euro cents per garment. And adding some more countries to the granular table, we can see some further deviations. So for example, Norway's planned EPR system has quite a broad scope of textiles that would be captured in the system. As an example of what can happen if obligated companies do not comply with their EPR obligations, taking California's EPR system as an example, non-compliant producers can be fined between $10,000 to $50,000 per day of non-compliance, which is pretty huge. And similarly to countries like Germany, Spain, France, for waste streams that are traditionally covered by EPR systems, such as product packaging, whereby online platforms are required to verify producer EPR registrations before allowing the products to be listed for sale, and also being held liable for the non-compliance of sellers on their platform. There's been a group of industry stakeholders from the textiles value chain that have called for the same concept to be applied to textiles EPR systems. So it's quite probable that the same concept will be adopted for textiles EPR too. As textiles EPR systems start to become more established, perhaps I'll be able to share some examples of enforcement undertakings with the group in the future. But as the only existing textiles EPR system that's well established is in France, I haven't been able to identify any examples of enforcement activities thus far. Okay, now we're going to move on to a few country case studies to discuss the textiles EPR systems in different countries and have a look at how they work in practice. Firstly, we'll look at France. So in France, we know that 9 million textile items are sold every day, and that each person buys on average 40 items of clothing, 4 pairs of shoes, and 5 items of household linen each year. And this equates to 3.3 billion textile items per year, which equals 82 Eiffel Towers. So we know that France has a real demand for an EPR system to manage textile waste. Luckily, France is the pioneer of textiles EPR and has had an EPR system for textile waste since 2008. In 2008, 2.3 billion textile items were placed on the market in France, and this increased to 2.8 billion by 2018, and that's a 21% increase. The textiles EPR system in France applies to clothing, footwear, and household linens, and is primarily made up of clothing at 83%. Collective or individual compliance is permitted in France. 95% of the market are registered members of the Refashion collective compliance scheme. And Refashion have over 4,000 registered members and operate one textile collection point per 1,440 inhabitants of France. The current EPR fee is a maximum of 6 euro cents and an average of 1 euro cent per garment. The concept of eco-modulated EPR fees does apply to textiles in France, where producers of harder to recycle and less environmentally friendly products are charged higher EPR fees, and producers of easier to recycle products conversely are charged lower fees. There's 3 eco-modulation levels in France, one of which aims to encourage the design of more durable and resistant products, and another of which encourages the integration of recycled materials. As an example, producers that integrate 15% recycled fibers sourced from post-consumer textiles receive a 50% discount on their EPR fees. So 50% discount, that's quite a large discount. There's also some product marking requirements in France. Producers are obligated to display the Tryman logo and accompanying sorting instructions on in-scope textiles to inform consumers on how they can be collected for recycling. Is France's textiles EPR system successful? The answer is generally yes, and I would say that France's textiles EPR system is a good basis to follow for countries that are newly implementing EPR systems for textiles. France's textiles EPR system contributed to a 3-fold increase in the collection and recycling rates of consumer textiles since 2006. And the material recovery rate of consumer textiles in France can reach up to 90%. 49% of the French population declared that they buy less clothes than before, compared to 38% in 2021. And during the last 10 years, the level of EPR contributions has risen from 11 million euros to 25.5 million euros in 2019. Refashion also provides significant funding for research and development in the textiles sector, and they've provided 5.6 million euros over the last 12 years. Whilst the figures associated to the refashion system, well, the France system in general, show overwhelming success, there are some reports that most of the textiles collected in France are not necessarily treated within France and are instead exported to low or middle income countries. So we know that in 2021, refashion collected 244,000 tons of textiles, but according to a 2023 report, which was published by the Orr Foundation, 80% of the textiles collected in France are exported primarily to countries throughout the global south and to low and middle income countries that do not necessarily have the waste management resources to treat them. Moving on to a slightly shorter case study for Norway. In Norway, 106,000 tons of textiles were put on the market during 2022, which averaged 19 kilograms per inhabitant. And we know that Norway is a net importer of textiles with less than 5% local production. Norway, it doesn't have an active textiles EPR system, but they are planning one. We know that a working group for textiles EPR was commissioned by the Norwegian Ministry of Climate and Environment in September 2022. And the working group was tasked with providing a basis of knowledge that would be required for the introduction of a textiles EPR system and to provide recommendations of how a textiles EPR system could be designed for Norway specifically. The scope of textiles EPR in Norway would be classified as any product, regardless of the mixing or assembly process, which consists mainly of textile fibers or leather. So that could include things like clothing, workwear, footwear, accessories, and household textiles. And notably, items like furniture, mattresses, carpets, they would not be in scope of the textiles EPR system in Norway because these products are not mainly composed of textiles. Regarding the types of companies that would be obligated under Norway's textiles EPR system, any company that brings textiles into circulation on the Norwegian market for the first time, they will have obligations. And very importantly, this includes foreign companies that place products on the Norwegian market via online platforms, even if those companies don't have a physical presence in Norway. And similarly to France, the concept of eco-modulated EPR fees would also probably apply in Norway. It was advised that the environmental authorities should require producer responsibility organisations to develop a basic model for eco-modulation as soon as possible. Last but not least, we'll look at a case study for California's proposed textiles EPR system. Okay, great. We know that 17 million tons of textiles are discarded in the USA each year, and only 14.7 of them are recycled. And each consumer in the US discards more than 36 kilograms of clothing each year. Following some postponements to conduct wording negotiations during 2023, California's Textiles EPR Act is expected to be actioned during 2024. The scope would include apparel, accessories, handbags, curtains, furnishing, bedding, and other household textiles. Like I mentioned previously, non-compliance with the Act could incur pretty massive fines of up to $50,000 per day of non-compliance. The bill requires a program operator to submit a completed stewardship plan to the regulator for review and approval. CalRecycle, they'll be required to adopt regulations to implement the bill's requirements with an effective date not earlier than 31st of December 2025. The Act would give producers quite a number of obligations, including obligations to implement and fund a textiles EPR system firstly, but also obligations to make products more durable and easier to repair, reuse and recycle, and obligations to provide CalRecycle with a list of covered products that they sell, as well as an updated list of those products by 15th of January every year. Coming to the last segment of today's webinar, we have some slides just to quickly highlight WRAP's relationship with textiles and EPR systems. This presentation is provided an overview of textiles EPR systems around the world. If you would like to find out more about textiles EPR systems, and more specifically, the details of national textiles EPR systems, you can download WRAP's Textiles EPR Guide free of charge from our website. The guide provides lots of details about active or planned national textiles EPR systems in the countries that are listed on the slide. There's certainly EPR systems active or planned in a lot more countries than that. The guide is just there to give you an overview, and we can certainly answer questions on any of them afterwards if you would like to reach out to us. A quick couple of slides of how WRAP can support producers, retailers and brand owners with the explosion of international textiles EPR systems. An initial form of support that WRAP could provide is to conduct a legal exposure assessment to determine the obligations that a producer, retailer or brand owner has under applicable textiles EPR systems around the world. WRAP would evaluate the textile products and the sales arrangements of a company against the national textiles EPR legislation to determine the legal obligations possessed by the company in each specific country. And subsequently, in countries where producers do have legal obligations, WRAP can provide compliance recommendations that will allow them to fully fulfill their compliance obligations. And WRAP can also support with the implementation of those compliance arrangements. And that might include completing EPR registrations with regulators, implementing suitable collection and recycling compliance arrangements for the producer, submitting or supporting with the preparation and submission of sales declarations in each country, and also supporting with the preparation of information that producers are obligated to provide to end customers about the collection and recycling compliance arrangements that have been implemented and their EPR compliance status too. WRAP can also help companies to budget for textiles EPR compliance on a national, regional or global scale using forecast sales volumes and local EPR fee rates. We can provide advice on how preparation for reuse and recycling rates can be increased to meet ever-increasing regulatory targets. And WRAP can track and monitor existing and planned textiles EPR systems, which allows companies to be proactive with upcoming obligation changes and minimizes the risk of falling into non-compliance because of new legislation that the producers were unaware of. In regards to the tracking and monitoring existing and planned textiles EPR systems, WRAP offer a Textiles EPR Policy Digest subscription that can be subscribed to using the QR code provided on this slide. WRAP's Policy Digest, it essentially summarizes the key impacts of recent textiles EPR developments for businesses and what actions businesses need to take to comply with the policy changes in the short, medium and long term, ultimately helping businesses to be proactive with policy developments rather than reactive to fast approaching regulatory deadlines. The Policy Digest, it provides subscribers with updates on textile EPR developments around the world. That might include new or amended legislation or other things like government or regulator guidance that have just been published. WRAP's Textiles 2030 voluntary agreement is leading activities which prepares businesses for EPR compliance in several ways. And some examples include Textiles 2030 signatories designing products to be more recyclable by utilizing access to exclusive workshops and peer learning training sessions, and signatories engaging with a durability study to develop an industry standard. And the outputs from that project may help to legislate minimum durability of clothing in Europe. By utilizing access to the exclusive workshops and peer learning training sessions to design products to be more reusable and recyclable, like I mentioned on the previous slide, the signatories can benefit from cheaper EPR fees, where producers of easier to recycle products receive EPR fee discounts as mandated by the regulations. So WRAP's voluntary action programs, i.e. Textiles 2030, they can help companies to satisfy various EPR fee eco-modulation criteria in countries around the world, which allows them to benefit from reduced EPR fees. Textiles 2030 is also helping members to pilot alternative business models, as well as supporting on business case development and economic modeling to help scale these circular business models. Members of Textiles 2030 are being supported to set up individual take-back and recycling schemes and to better understand the end markets for the used clothing they produce. And last but not least, WRAP regularly facilitate policy working group discussions between businesses and governments to help inform future policy direction, but also to help businesses prepare for future policy in advance of any changes. How can you find out more? If you want to find out more about WRAP's Textiles EPR Policy Digest offering or bespoke EPR services, please do reach out to me directly. If you want to hear, if you'd like to talk about membership to WRAP's Textiles 2030 initiative, please reach out to my colleague Claire Carroll. Both of our email addresses are on this slide. If you want to hear us talk about Textiles EPR a bit more, I would encourage you to attend the Draper Sustainable Fashion Conference that's being held in London on the 13th of March. WRAP will be speaking about Textiles EPR at this conference, but the presentation at that conference, it will have more of a focus on Textiles EPR plans in the UK specifically. So if you're interested in UK plans, then we certainly do encourage you to come along to that conference and listen to our talk. Okay, great. So that concludes the presentation. I hope that you all found it somewhat interesting, but regardless, thanks very much for listening and indulging me anyway. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the session, a recording of the webinar and the slides will be circulated to attendees later. For those of you that have an interest in reading more about Textiles EPR, there are 3 additional slides at the end of the presentation that provide hyperlinks to relevant articles or reports. Before we close the session, we did want to do a quick Q&A. When I say a quick Q&A, I certainly didn't expect to have this many questions in the chat. I'm going to do my best and I'm going to answer a select few. If I can find your email address afterwards, corresponding to your name and your question, I'll answer directly via email. But I'm certainly not going to be able to answer all of these questions that have come in live. So I do encourage you to reach out using my email on the screen here if I don't get to your question. There's one question related to harmonization of Textiles EPR systems, i.e. are the structures and producer requirements of these newly emerging Textiles EPR systems harmonized? The answer is yes and no. So in terms of the European Union strategy for sustainable and circular textiles, it's likely that there will be some harmonization between different EU member states. The level of harmonization will be dependent on whether or not the European Commission pass a directive or a regulation. We know that the proposal has come in the form of the waste management, the Waste Framework Directive changes. So it's a directive, and that means that each EU country will need to transpose the changes in international law directly. And when they do that transposition, it's inevitable that there will be some deviations between country to country, and there will certainly be deviations in registration and reporting requirements at the very least. So there may be some harmonization. There will certainly be some deviations. We don't know how big that gap will be until we start to see more countries implementing. Another question that we've had is, once we've registered in a textiles EPR system, other than regularly paying EPR fees, do we need to do anything? The answer is yes. So in order for EPR fees to be calculated accurately, producers need to submit systematic sales declarations, and the format of those declarations and the frequency in which the declarations need to be submitted, that varies from country to country, but you do need to keep on top of that and make sure you're submitting the declarations. Regarding EPR systems for other waste streams, many countries require producers to re-register or renew their producer registrations each year. So that's likely going to be the case for textiles EPR systems as well. And similarly, there are some informative obligations that producers need to fulfill. So, you might need to tell consumers about the collection networks that are available to them. And the way that can be fulfilled will vary from country to country, and the exact obligations, they'll vary from country to country as well. So there's a few different obligations that you might have depending on the country. There's 30 other questions. Some of them are not so applicable. So what's classed as an online marketplace to be obligated to register? Is this any business that has an e-commerce website? That would depend on the country. So technically, yes, any business that has an e-commerce website will be classed as an online marketplace. Sometimes the foreign ones won't be obligated. Sometimes if they're doing cross-border shipments, they will. It really depends on the national system. Is India not included? I don't know of any textiles EPR system in India specifically. So that's not included in this presentation or the guide. And generally, there's a lot of feedback, there's a lot of questions, and I do sincerely apologize if I haven't had a chance to get to your question. I'm going to go through all of them today and tomorrow, and I'll come back to you via email. There's just too many for me to answer live, but I thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I say again, I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Feel free to reach out to myself or Claire if you have questions directly. In the meantime, I wish everybody a nice afternoon. Thank you for coming. Yeah, thank you.